Right. Hello, everyone. We are in for the first week of September for our first video. Now, as I had mentioned in our previous video, I wanted to take a break this week between our going into our next video in relation to the path that Japan takes toward World War II. We are going to do the next video on that next week. And that's kind of going to be a big one compared to some of the last one was big too, but it's going to be a major one that's got some implications. So I want to take some time on that and kind of take a break from discussing that. So, for a topic for this week that I was able to kind of come up with, I had kind of reminisced about some topics that were more obscure, not as well known. And one that had come up to me during my little bit of a venturing here was a particular rebellion that had happened in colonial times that I had relatively not heard of it too much until I attended in my college history education courses, of which the professor I had was among the best that I could have possibly asked for. He was an excellent professor, and he spent like 2 whole days in class discussing this particular event. And until I attended that class, this was a relatively unknown historical rebellion to me, at least the intricacies of it. And the rebellion in question here is called Bacon's Rebellion. It has nothing to do with ham or pork or anything like that. It has nothing to do with a pig. This is the name of the guy that did it. His last name was Bacon. Yes, I'm sure that's going to get a lot of different comments. But Bacon's Rebellion is a colonial rebellion that happened in 1676 in Virginia, and it was a rebellion of in basic regards, it was a rebellion against the Virginia Tidewater aristocracy. And those rebelling against the power and the wealth of the Tidewater aristocracy were from a multitude of backgrounds of the poor end of the economic spectrum, from poor interior farmers to indentured servants to even enslaved Africans were actually took part in this. And Bacon's rebellion is significant because in the long run, it's going to lead to two big things. Number one, it's going to lead to a tighter crown direct rule of Virginia. But the second and probably more remembered aspect of this rebellion is it leads to a gradual abolishment of the indentured servitude practice and instead starts institutionalizing the use of African slavery in Virginia and in the South as a whole. So that is going to be the ultimate kind of consequence here. So this is not going to be the longest of videos by any means. I mean, this was a relatively obscure topic. It was a relatively short rebellion. It didn't even last a full year, but it's something that I just wanted to take a look at this week as it kind of came up, and it's something that we could definitely kind of have a little bit of a discussion of. So, as we stated, this is going to be essentially a rivalry between the interior landowners in Virginia and the elite plantation owners. And Bacon's Rebellion didn't just come out of nowhere. There were many grievances and aggravations that the interior landowning farmers of the Virginia colony had for decades against the landowning wealthy aristocracy on the coastline. And that goes all the way back to the founding with Jamestown, when plantation systems were first set up in what is now Virginia. As we all probably know from our school years, Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement in North America. It was founded in 1607 on the James River in Virginia, and it was at the Jamestown colony that tobacco first began to be cultivated in Virginia on large plantations. And mind you, you might think back toward the 19th century, well, wasn't the South's main cash crop cotton? It was by that point. But back in the day, before the cotton gin, these cotton was not that profitable of a crop. It took so long to separate the fibers from the seeds, and without that hand cranking tool to actually do it, cotton wasn't that profitable. The main cash crop in the South prior to the 1790s was tobacco, and this was the first cash crop that appeared. And this was the cash crop that was brought to Jamestown back in the 1600s. Tobacco seeds had first been brought to Jamestown in 1610 by colonist John Rolfe, which you'll probably know his name a bit because he's the guy that ends up marrying Pocahontas. Now, it did not occur as it happened in the Disney movie. I can inform you of that. Now, roast tobacco was of a sweeter variety. It was not as bitter as most other common commercial brands of tobacco at the time, and it quickly became Jamestown's main cash crop. Now, tobacco's global popularity encouraged the establishment of more plantations as the colony in Virginia expanded beyond the original borders of the Jamestown limits. So as it went into outright what will become the whole modern state of Virginia, it began to have more and more plantations set up for the growing of tobacco. It would encroach on lands in the process that belonged to the native Powhatan Confederation of Native Americans, which the Powhatans were the tribe that Pocahontas was from. Now, the English settlers would often purchase Powhatan land for underappreciated prices. They did typically buy the land, but since Indians at this time didn't really have any concept, and they, in many ways, they don't believe in it, and it's totally understandable. They didn't have a concept in many regards of what land ownership was because they'd never done it themselves. They simply used the land. They didn't think that any one person had a right to own it. They had a right to own the rights to use it for farming and hunting, but not for actually owning the land outright. And that may confuse quite a few of them because this is an entirely new concept that that the white man from Europe is introducing to them. And the Powhatans, sell their land. They go ahead and sell their land to the English settlers for underappreciated prices, thinking they are merely selling the right to use the land. They're not thinking that they're outright selling, ownership of it. And then particularly to find out that's not how the English view it at all. Jamestown Governor James Thomas West would end up refusing to address Powhatan concerns over the practices, and this would lead to the First Powhatan War that lasted from 1610 to 1614. It would end when John Rolfe would marry Pocahontas, who was the daughter of the local Powhatan chieftain. And between 1614 and 1622, after that war had ended, there was more land taken during that peaceful time. Plantations were often worked by indentured servants as they were being set up on these large tobacco farms. Now, what indentured servants were not quite like slaves in many ways it was voluntary. You put yourself into it. What it essentially was that servants that agreed to work on a given plantation or for a farmer for 7 years would get to have passage over to the Americas paid for by that person they agreed to work for 7 years. After you completed your contract, after you worked your 7 years and fulfilled your end of the bargain for them paying for your passage over here, you would be set free and would, as part of the deal, at the time, you would be granted land upon gaining your freedom, thus populating the colony even further with more low income poor farmers that would be able to go out and settle new plots of land. Now, slaves from Africa did exist in Virginia at this time. They were a relatively new phenomenon. The first shipment of slaves to Jamestown didn't even come until 1619, and it was more or less by accident. It was from a Dutch ship that had stopped to resupply in Jamestown. They had not stopped for the purpose of selling slaves, but they had a couple on board. They had about 20 of them, I believe the number was, and they did end up selling them to one of the local plantation owners, but they were not the main method of labor use on the tobacco plantations at this point, because at the time, indentured servitude was far more profitable for many plantation owners because they could easily get more, they could pay to get people over to the Americas, have them for 7 years, and then after that point, it would encourage, further settlement of land and expand the colony even further. Now, the Second Powhatan War would come about in 1622. It would go on for about 4 years until 1626, which would open with the massacre of 300 colonists by local Powhatan Native Americans. Now, the colonists, in the aftermath of that war, of course, they ended up winning that. They would win even more land from the Native Americans, and every 7 years, as indentured servant groups would be freed of their contracts, they had no need to get further slaves because they're still expanding the colony. Because every 7 years, when a new group of former indentured servants is set free and goes out to settle their own farms, there's new settlers that are coming to the Americas every single week. Every single week, new indentured servants are coming in. So it was a profitable system, and they're getting new servants to replace the ones that they're losing every 7 years. After a third Powhatan War that lasted from 1644 to 1646, the Confederation ended up being dissolved, and the colonists received even larger land tracts in Virginia, largely confining the remaining Native Americans to reservations in the far interior of the state, of the colony. not stated at the time. Now, the Native Americans ended up getting pushed to the interior, which is going to create a conflict in the future because by the time as the decades push on and these indentured servants are freed and they're given, okay, you're free. Now we're going to fulfill our end of the bargain here. You're going to get this plot of land. The problem was the most profitable land for growing tobacco plantations was on the coast. And about 1650, the land on Virginia's Chesapeake coastline had largely been taken up. It had largely been, farmed, set up and set aside in plots and sold. So any new land for these new indentured servants that are now becoming free and are now becoming farmers themselves is going to have to be in the interior. Well, that's going to create problems because you got a bunch of indentured servants that have land that's been promised to them that are now going to have to go to the interior of the state where the land has not been settled yet. The land is still, in many cases, wilderness. It's still woods. They're going to have to actually clear it and actually get it prepared to even farm. But on top of that, this is also where you have pushed the Native Americans after the Powhatan Wars, and that's going to create conflicts in terms of land claims because now you're going to have Native Americans who are saying, "Hey, what are you doing on my land? You pushed me here. You said I could have this. Now you're pushing more people on me." And it's going to create even more problems. Now, in 1640, slavery was officially introduced as a legal option in Virginia for punishment, which would elevate the status of indentured servants and landless citizens, as they were technically no longer at the very bottom of the barrel. There was a worse situation, that of being a slave, which is going to make the indentured servants and poor farmers, they're going to be like the bottom of the class that's not enslaved. They're going to be the bottom of the free person class, and that's going to make them resent to a large degree, start resenting their place in society, that they're just barely better than slaves in terms of social standing. Now, what this had gone on for decades. Indian raids became a constant problem you know, as indentured servants are setting up their new farms on lands that were promised to Native Americans after the Powhatan Wars, but they can't settle on the coastline because those have already been taken up, and the people that live on the coast are already wealthy, rich planters because they got the best soil. So this goes on for a couple of decades, and it is not until our story of where Bacon's rebellion starts to ferment doesn't come about until the 1640s, and that is the arrival of one big figure that's going to play a part in this down the road, and that is William Berkeley. In 1641, William Berkeley became Virginia's royal governor. He was a courtier in the palace of Charles the First and was knighted and very well connected to back home in the English court. He had his own plantation set up near Jamestown, which at the time was serving as Virginia's colonial capital. Williamsburg did not become the colonial capital until 1699. And he had actually led the attack that ended the Third Powhatan War, but during treaty negotiations, Berkeley had included a monopoly on deerskins and fur trade for he and his friends to get a lucrative trade deal from the Native Americans after they had just beaten them. He offered safe haven at the same time to royalists during the Civil War back in England and was censured by the new government because of his support for royalist policies. He would end up resigning the governorship in 1652, but kept lands and trade relations with the Native Americans that he had brokered during his time as royal governor. And the other big figure that, of course, is the namesake of this whole thing is Nathaniel Bacon. Now, Nathaniel Bacon, he came from wealthy landowners back in England. He was actually related to Berkeley by marriage. He was the nephew of Berkeley's wife, so he actually was kind of related to the guy that he's going to end up going against. And he had actually studied at Cambridge and traveled Europe during his youth, as he used his parents' money to actually go do what he wanted, as his parents were quite rich. Now, in 1665, Bacon was accused of cheating on acquaintance out of his inheritance, which back then could be a quite serious charge. His father, instead of letting his son face the consequences of his actions, instead to try to shield his son from any punishment that he might receive for having done such a thing, he sends his son with some of a large sum of money to the colony of Virginia across the water, across the Atlantic. And when Bacon gets there, he uses the money that his father gave him to buy land outside Jamestown in the Tidewater region. Now, Berkeley, who is now governor of Virginia by this time, he has regained his post as royal governor. He names Bacon to his council shortly after Bacon arrives there. And by 1675, significant numbers of indentured servants, black and white, as even Even formerly enslaved peoples have gotten free at this point and are starting to form their own farms, are now owning small farms in Virginia. Now, choice lands, as we mentioned, belonged to the upper class and were only sold amongst themselves. So it was very rare that any of these poor farmers could get any of the land in the Tidewater region, because often when these upper class wealthy landowners in the Tidewater region would have land that they wanted to sell, they would only sell it to those of the aristocratic class. They would not consider selling it to those who were on the poor end. And more free servants would end up taking land from natives, which caused further raids that destabilized the trade and commerce within the colony, and also fostered disappointment among the poor farmers and the former indentured servants, and saying that the government isn't doing its part, for us. We need these Native American raids addressed, and they just seem content with their land because they're not having to face Native American raids. Bacon would advocate for either removing or slaughtering the tribes. He was actually calling for almost like a genocide of Native Americans. Berkeley refused when Bacon made this demand to him in about 1675, as he held quite profitable trade deals with them, both in the furs and deerskins, and instead Berkeley opted for defense and containment policies through the construction of forts in the Virginian interior. So he argued, I'm not going to go out there and, destroy these Native American tribes. I got good trade with them, and so do so many of my partners. We have no reason to go against these tribes. They're raiding because you guys are settling on their land. So, if anything, we will build forts to better provide a military presence to protect you. Bacon objected to this plan that Berkeley had because he claimed that the forts that would be built would not stop the raids. Instead, the only thing they would accomplish would be raising the taxes on poor Virginians, as this would no doubt cause a tax increase that would have to be paid most thoroughly by the lower classes. Bacon would end up charging Berkeley with corruption, as he charged him with several things, but Bacon was also quite hypocritical considering the factor that Bacon was in government in the Virginian colony. He was even in the Tidewater region himself, but yet he kind of paints himself as being, affected by Berkeley's policies. In many ways, he himself had profited off of them. For one, he charged Berkeley with preferment in government positions to friends and relatives, like Bacon was himself. That's why he was in government, but yet he charged Berkeley with that crime. He would charge Berkeley with profiting from trade from Native Americans, which we can suggest we later come find out one of the only reasons Bacon may have made that charge was because Bacon had increasingly asked Berkeley to cut him in on the trade, and Berkeley had refused to do so. So now he's calling Berkeley out on something because he's not getting part of the money. And he also charged Berkeley with enriching himself at taxpayer expense by the increase of the taxes for the forts, which may have been the only legitimate argument that he could have possibly made. Now, so this little spat between the two would continue. At one point, Bacon would approach Berkeley directly with a group of followers in Jamestown, asking him for a military commission so that he could go out and lead a raid to just annihilate some local Native American villages that were harassing farmers on the frontier. Berkeley refused to do so, called him, and words got heated. Eventually, Berkeley ended up calling Bacon a traitor, and when words continued to get heated, Berkeley had exposed his chest to Bacon in front of the crowd and pretty much gave Bacon's like, you know what? Go ahead, shoot me. Shoot me if you're so confident. He didn't do it, of course, but things had intensified. On July 30th of 1676, Bacon would outline his objections to Governor Berkeley in his Declaration of the People of Virginia. In this declaration, he would present 8 counts that he was charging the governor with, which he presented in full, but made no mention of his own profit from the governor's plans in any of these counts that he charged him with. Bacon presented himself in the declaration as a man of the people, willing to fight for interior farmers against the elite of the Tidewater region, which, again, quite ironic considering the factor that Bacon himself was from the Tidewater region and had benefited from the very policies that he was lambasting against. He helped to lead vigilante raids with his followers against Native Americans in order to prove his word and to prove that he was acting in their best interests. He was pretty much one to do a Native American slaughter, is what he was one to do. And Berkeley was correctly saying, no, we're not doing that. Bacon took it upon himself and led vigilante raids anyway with his followers he began to gather. He would immediately attract a group of roughly 300 to 500 men due to his promises. Among his provinces that Bacon promised were freedom to indentured servants, lower taxes, better lands for freemen, such as lands in the Tidewater region, and security for interior farmers by elimination of Native American tribes. Now, Bacon would also foster class resentment by arguing that his followers' economic problems and problems were caused by the wealthy landowners in the Tidewater region keeping the resources for themselves and being protected and encouraged by Berkeley through his policies. This would attract the message that Bacon gave attracted not just poor interior farmers, it attracted current indentured servants, both black and white, and even managed to attract some enslaved African Americans, which was quite astonishing that you had people of these two different races, black and whites, at a time in the 1600s, at a time where that is not normal by any means, because we know how racial things were back then, and they're actually working together and coming together in this rebellion. This scares the crap out of the local government. It scares everything out of them. They are scared to death that these two races are working together. Now, Berkeley would deny the charges that Bacon charged him with. He denied any wrongdoing on his part and he maintained that Bacon was guilty of treason and that he was simply acting as a traitor would. Bacon refuted that he held no quarrel with the crown, and thus he was not legally guilty of treason, which he kind of had a point there. He has again insisted, my quarrel is not with the king. My quarrel is not with the government at home. My quarrel is with you, not the crown. And if I have not betrayed the king, I have not committed treason. And that was an argument that Bacon made himself. Now, roughly a century after this, when the American Revolution is going on, some of our founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson most notably, kind of painted Bacon as, this patriot precursor who had kind of started the first real rebellion against British tyranny. Well, that wasn't really the case because Bacon himself didn't really view himself as rebelling against the British government. He simply viewed himself as rebelling against the local colonial governor who he viewed as corrupt. He didn't view the British crown as corrupt or that British tyranny was affecting the government of the colony. He affected it that it was one man that had kind of corrupted others around him. So that view wasn't entirely true, but it was something that ended up being taken a century later to try to correlate that, we're not unfounded in rebelling against English authority because it happened a century before in our very own colony of Virginia. So they tried to connect the dots a little bit where they thought they might be able to try. So Bacon refutes that he's not a traitor because I'm not rebelling against the crown. Now, feeling that he had exhausted his legal and diplomatic avenues at this point, Bacon would lead his 500 followers to march on the colonial capital of Jamestown. Berkeley and his supporters ended up fleeing in fear. They got out of Jamestown before Bacon and his men arrived, and upon their arrival, Bacon's followers ended up burning the settlement into ruins. They burned Jamestown to the ground. It was later rebuilt, but it wouldn't be the colonial capital for much longer after that. This was 1676, and by 1699, it got moved to Williamsburg. But they would rebuild Jamestown. But yeah, they burnt the whole settlement. They burnt the whole town into ruins, and then him and his followers waited in the ruins for the military response that they expected Berkeley was going to give. And I don't really have a whole lot of images for this at all. So just to give some context here we have, and most of these, of course, are not from the period. So this is one of the few we have from the period. So this is a depiction from a 1663 painting of Governor William Berkeley. So this is probably the only one that's authentic. There is no paintings that exist of Nathaniel Bacon that we know of. So a lot of what we guess he looked like is based off artist conjecture, but Berkeley we actually do have a portrait of. And then here we have a depiction from the 19th century depicting the altercation in which Governor Berkeley kind of bared his chest and threatened and kind of challenged Bacon to shoot him. Bacon being the guy here, he's often depicted in, kind of a plumed hat with the common 16th century look of an Englishman. And Berkeley, of course, is baring his chest to him, kind of after he's called him a traitor and, threatening him like, go ahead, shoot me if you think you're so competent. after he's refused to give him a military commission. And then here we have a common depiction of Bacon with his followers as they were going through Jamestown and burning it with his 500 followers. And Bacon is right there in the center. And then a depiction of the ruins of Jamestown that were left after the burning in 1676. It was later rebuilt. So this is by this point, Bacon has committed everything. He looks like he's on a winning streak here. The royal governor and his cronies have fled the colonial capital. The colonial capital of Jamestown has been burned. It looks like the rebellion is a success. They're just waiting for the military response. They know that's going to happen. And they've gotten this assembled army of over 500 people, probably growing by the day, of indentured servants, poor farmers, formerly enslaved people that are banding together to resist what they see as the tyranny of the aristocracy. All this comes to a crashing, sudden halt, not because of something that Berkeley does, but because Bacon ends up dying suddenly. He ends up dying in October of 1676 of dysentery. And upon Bacon's death, his little rebellion that he had grown up kind of starts collapsing in on itself. Without his leadership, they just fall apart. Now, a man named John Ingram did try to take charge after Bacon's death, but the mob gradually dissipated and started to return home from Jamestown, which weakened their numbers even further. Mind you, they only had about 500 people to start with. Berkeley would launch his attack at that very moment with troops from local warships that had remained anchored in Chesapeake Bay and from local loyalist regiments that had stayed loyal. And he launched his attack on Jamestown on the weakened rebels, which disarmed them shortly after this event. 23 leaders of Bacon's rebellion that were left alive did end up being hanged, and that kind of ended the rebellion then and there after the burning of Jamestown. So after Bacon suddenly dies, everything just falls apart. It was a rather quick rebellion. It was in some ways it was a noble rebellion, but at the same time it was not, because some of the causes that they wanted for this, like slaughtering Native Americans, that was not in any way a good cause. So the aftermath of this rebellion, despite Berkeley ending the rebellion, he thought he'd done a pretty good job. It had ended rather quickly. He had managed to retake the colonial capital. Unfortunately for him, the king back in England didn't quite think so. King Charles II was quite irate when he heard about the rebellion that had broke out in Virginia. He recalled Berkeley as royal governor and then called him back to England to explain himself, at the same time sending a squadron of warships with about 1,000 redcoat troops to the colony of Virginia to try to reinforce law and order there. Berkeley would go back to England to try to explain himself to the king, but he ended up dying shortly after arriving there. The king would appoint Herbert Jeffreys, one of his royal advisors, to the position of royal governor of Virginia. Jeffreys would use around 200 troops to restore order and try to reduce the wealth and power of the elite plantation owners that he had also viewed had been instigators of the conflict. He would end up dying just a couple years after, just 2 years in 1678, so relatively quickly. Now, the wealthy elite of the Tidewater region, who had huge influences in the local colonial legislature, the House of Burgesses, they realized that Bacon's rebellion was close shave, that it could have gone far worse, that they had come relatively close to disaster in losing their power and influence within the colony. So they took measures within the colonial legislature to ensure that something like Bacon's rebellion would never be able to happen again. And some of these were to appease the poor farmers. Others was to make sure that blacks and whites would never be able to unite in that way, in that manner again. They wanted to keep slaves separated from the poor farmers and the indentured servants. So the first act of legislation that the House of Burgesses ended up passing, they barred indentured servitude in Virginia, since it had created a disgruntled and heavily armed citizenry. So indentured servitude, we're done with it. We're not doing it anymore. It's done. All the current indentured servants, they are free. So that kind of sets the indentured servants up. Like they can just come readily over to Virginia and start buying out land without having to do 7 years of work. The second act they would do was they would institutionalize racial slavery and establish Jamestown as a major slave port. Since the indentured servitude is no longer going on, you got to have work in the field somewhere, and the legislature comes up with the solution. Well, we can get rid of the indentured servants and we can start relying more on the slaves like the French and the Spanish do in their colonies. In 1650, and just to show you how much this exploded, in 1650, slaves only numbered around 300 in the Virginia colony. By 1700, there were over 13,000 after this institutionalization of the thing. Poll taxes were also introduced to affect poor farmers, many of whom were mainly black, and thus this kind of alienated the racial aspect where black poor farmers were not able to vote because they couldn't necessarily afford to pay the poll tax. Not to say that there weren't white poor farmers in the Virginia interior, but many of them were tended to be African American. Now, to appease the interior farmers, the headright system was reinstituted. This would promise 50 acres to any free man of, of land that ended up being taken from Native Americans. So, in a way, although Governor Berkeley and his aristocrats had resisted taking further land from Native Americans and slaughtering them, the after Bacon's rebellion, the new colonial legislature, they kind of argue, you know what? I don't care if it makes them happy and ensures that they're not going to rise up against us again. Let them have it. If for every 50 acres of land taken from Native Americans, that is entitled to at least one free man. It would encourage colonization and the slaughter of Native Americans on lands that were previously promised to them, which caused Native reservations to continue to shrink in the Virginia colony even further. So the ultimate outcome of this was the Virginia legislature, the colonial legislature realized we cannot allow these classes to unite again. So, in one regard, they tried to appease the interior farmers in the former indentured servants who had been the main driving force behind Bacon's support and tried to appease them any way they could. They abolished indentured servitude. They reinstituted the headright system where for every 50 acres of land taken from natives that you can claim that as your own. you know they did try to generally appease that class so they would not do this again, while at the same time they're also going with the racial aspect where African slaves were now going to institutionalize slavery as the main driving labor force for our tobacco plantations, and at the same time for those blacks in the colony that are poor farmers and are not enslaved peoples, they will be subject to a poll tax, which they will very unlikely be able to pay, and thus they're going to be kept out of the political power. So Bacon's rebellion, in one way, it ended indentured servitude in Virginia, but at the same time, it started institutionalizing the institution of African slavery within the colony, and that was a major detriment that would have further consequences down the road. Most notably, I mean, it would culminate in the Civil War about 2 centuries later when Virginia did secede and become one of the Confederate states. But that is the gist of Bacon's rebellion. So it was, in many ways, it's a rebellion of the poor and the enslaved against the aristocrats in Virginia, but in other ways, it's also, you know, in many ways, it's not a revolt against British tyranny, as I think many people have tried to portray it as in the past. It's simply a revolt of the lower classes against the upper classes. And then the ultimate outcome of it, it failed, but depending on what race or what class you were in, it failed or you got some better treatment afterwards. And for many, if you were an indentured servant or poor farmer, you kind of got better treatment. But if you were black, you were either poor or you were enslaved. Neither one was not exactly a good thing. So it definitely kind of aggravated race relations a bit in the colony going into the centuries afterward, but in the long run. But again, a little unique little rebellion that ended up happening in colonial history. Not exactly the longest of topics, but one that, until, like I said before, I had actually come across it during my college studies, during my college years. I had not really heard of this too much. I'd heard, I think, of the name of it, but I didn't really know what it was about and what it all entailed. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, anything you'd like to add or anything like that, feel free to put it in the comment section and I'll be able to go through them when I can. As I said, for next week, we are going to be covering the next video in the series with Japan. That is going to be on the Russo-Japanese War, where Japan is going to end up taking on an European power and actually win, which is Russia. So that was a big shock at the time. So that will be next week. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, and we'll see you all back here next week for that video when it comes out.